Fantasy football is a game that's largely about numbers to many of who play, but that's not always true. And things quickly change in the NFL. So numbers can't always account for those changes that occur for teams or the entire NFL. Today, we're going to learn about some of the important NFL trends that could impact fantasy football from Robert Mays of The Athletic. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Prize Picks, the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country. I'm Jim Coventry, joined by Robert Mays. Remember to follow Robert at Robert Mays, M-A-Y-S, and you can find me at Jim Coventry NFL. Today's show will include Robert Mays of The Athletic and I talking about NFL trends that could give us an edge in our fantasy football in 2024. Now, Robert is the host of The Athletic Football Show, and if you're not listening to that show, by the time you're done with this show, my guess is you're going to make sure you're following Robert. You're going to find The Athletic Podcast, and you're going to begin to follow that, because this is one of the only shows that I'll listen to. And because I don't want to hear the fantasy stuff, I want to hear the real football stuff. And Robert brings up. Robert, would love to welcome you in. Thank you for hanging out with the RotoWire audience today. And just in general, are you getting ready for football season? And how hard is that process?
Oh, we definitely are. I mean, I think it's now the ramp up is happening. I'm starting to plan my training camp travel and where I'm going to be in July and August. And it's always a fun time of year. It's a little bit of a calm before the storm sort of feeling when you get to late June, but it'll be here before you know it.
And the whirlwind is beautiful, and we wouldn't have it any other way. We're going to start out talking some trends, Robert. And there are two things that I really noticed. There are a number of teams that use heavy personnel, and they're able to throw large and far average depth of target within that. And then there are some teams that run still the 11 personnel heavy. We'll start out talking about heavy personnel. And I want to start out talking about Arthur Smith, was with the Falcons, now with the Steelers, as well as the 49ers, the Dolphins, the Ravens, and the Texans. So it's 5 teams, and they use the most 21 personnel. So that's 2 running backs on the field at a time. These teams also will, like the Falcons, will use 80% heavy, which means 2 or 3 tight ends. So it's all mixed up. But what we notice is 3 of those teams, you got the Niners, the Dolphins, and the Texans. They come from the Kyle Shanahan tree, really probably Shanahan's dad's tree, if you want to put it that way. But one thing I want to point out, why were all of these offense, except the Falcons last year, successful using that heavy personnel?
I think what it allows you to do is it allows you to dictate to defenses, because if you look at specifically the Falcons over the last couple of years and the Niners last year and even the Texans, the amount of cover 3 that these teams see out of those heavy personnel looks on defense, where you have base defense with 3 linebackers on the field, it gives you a regulated set of coverages for your offense. So if you know playing the percentages on 1st and 10, if we have a fullback on the field, they're going to be in a simplistic coverage like cover 3, let's say 45% of the time. It really allows you to draw up offensive game plans that can slice and dice overly simplistic defenses. So, I mean, just think about it in these terms. If you have heavy personnel and the defense is matched with heavy personnel and they have 3 linebackers on the field, in theory, that should be a lesser pass defense than if they have a nickelback on the field or dime personnel on the field. So I think a lot of these teams are lining up in heavy personnel to dictate what they're going to see from defenses and to make throwing the ball easier.
And as you mentioned that, Robert, most of these teams had a very high depth of pass. And when you watch the games, you see the 49ers getting explosive plays. It could be to Ayuk. It could be to Samuel. More short passes to Samuel. Kittle going deep. And then, of course, you have the Dolphins, Tyreek Hill, of course, Jalen Waddle get a little closer to the line. But you see, and then Nico Collins, we saw him just running behind defenses. And as you mentioned, predictable defenses. And so these teams were able to take advantage of that. So the question is, you already pointed out how they're able to get this downfield passing. The Ravens are the team. They also have a deeper downfield average pass, but they didn't have the success. Is it because of the lack of receiving weapons they have in the downfield game? What's the issue there?
It's a good question. I think that they have kind of lacked a true vertical presence within that offense. And I don't really know who that's supposed to be. You know, Rashad Bateman was kind of plugged into that role last year, which that's not really his game, especially when he was coming out of Minnesota. And Zay Flowers, I actually think Zay Flowers is more capable as like an outside the numbers X sort of receiver than you might think given his physical profile. But again, you don't necessarily want to drop him in that spot. And if you look at the guys they added in the draft, the guy's name is escaping me, the guy they drafted in the 4th round.
Devontae Walker.
Yes. So Devontae Walker is, again, somebody you can drop in that's more of a vertical presence. And that's what I want to see. Can we have somebody that's more speed based that allows these other pieces to kind of fit into the roles that they're better suited for within this offense? And I also just think that in year 2 of any offense, you take a step forward. You have an understanding of this is what we do well. This is what we don't do well. Or what if we just totally chopped off this quarter of what we're doing because that doesn't fit our identity? You just streamline and you get a more distilled version of who you're supposed to be. And I think that's a pretty common occurrence for offensive systems heading from year 1 into year 2. And that's what the Ravens are doing.
Now, I noticed as the season went on, Lamar Jackson was after week 12, we're seeing a little more passing yardage. His multi-touchdown games went up. Mark Andrews was out. If Devontae Walker doesn't hit as a deep threat, is Mark Andrews going to continue to be, even though he's in the seam, is he going to be more of that downfield presence if they don't have another one? Do they have to go back to counting on him? Because he's done well in the downfield role in the past. What would you expect from Mark Andrews coming back from injury? I know he did play in the AFC Championship game, but otherwise he was out for quite a while.
I think I would expect him to be a very productive player. Again, just an understanding like, okay, how do we use this piece in the overall formula of what we want this offense to be heading into our second year? And I'm curious what the receiving roles end up looking like for this team and for this offense, because, you know, Zay Flowers, they used him on a lot of kind of gimmicky short stuff earlier in the season, a lot of schemed touches close to the line of scrimmage. But I love him as somebody who can push vertically and some of those outbreaking routes. I mean, him in one-on-one outside the numbers, I think was more of a threat than I expected him to be. So if you have that sort of presence, how does Mark Andrews fit with that? I think those are the conversations that Todd Monken and that offensive staff is going to be spending the spring and the summer having as they figure out what the 2.0 version of this offense is supposed to look like.
Now, you mentioned Zay Flowers, and he had a couple of his big yardage games in the NFL playoffs. Was that because teams were selling out, putting far less attention and dropping bodies back to try to put pressure on Lamar by blitzing? Why did Flowers have the big yardage games in the playoffs? Because he had not more than an 80-yard game, I think, through like week 15.
I think that's a little bit of breaks the ball or bounces of the ball, a little bit of luck. You know, there were a couple drops in that Steelers game that famously where they should have won that game. I think he had a touchdown called back in the Bengals game, I want to say it was. So I feel like there's kind of some hidden production lying there for him throughout the season. But the blitz point is a very good one. I mean, that's what teams did in the postseason against Lamar, and that's what teams are going to continue to do. We did a show, I want to say a couple of weeks ago on the Athletic Football Show, talking about some of the lingering questions we have from last season about all of these teams. And the one I had about the Ravens was, is this approach to Lamar Jackson, this blitz-heavy approach that teams are taking, and his kind of sputtering when that happens, is that something to be worried about? And if you look back at the last 3, 4, 5 years, when teams heat up Lamar Jackson, when they make him get rid of the ball quickly, his production drops precipitously compared to the rest of the league. And we've seen better answers against the blitz with Monken last year than we did with Greg Roman, especially in the second half of that Texans game in the postseason. But I still think that approach and who Lamar is when teams are sending extra bodies at him, I still think that is overall work in progress for this team.
Now, as you say that, Robert, in the regular season, it seems the game planning by opponents is not as hyper-specific as it is in the playoffs. Belichick was always the king of the hyper-specific game plan. So is Lamar Jackson likely to be safe from seeing the playoff-type defenses in the regular season? Or do you think there's a blueprint out that it's been there for a while? So do we expect defense are just going to go as they typically would? Or will you see a different approach?
I think it's toned down slightly. If you look at it over the last probably 3, 4, 5, I mean, since he became a starter, 2019, I think, and don't quote me on this, but if you looked at the numbers, I would assume that Lamar is the most blitzed quarterback in the NFL since he became a starter. So that would be 4 or 5 seasons. And it's around like 33, 34%. That's extremely high. And so I think that is what you're typically going to continue to see. I think teams are going to keep heating them up until they can consistently prove that you're going to get hurt if you do that. And in the playoffs, it's obviously ramped up. I mean, what the Texans were doing to him, especially in the first half of that game, I mean, that's a situation where it's over half of his dropbacks. And I think that when you see a team play over the course of the regular season, you don't have those, like you said, hyper specific sort of game plans where all the levers are turned all the way to 10, just because that's not how teams approach regular season games. But I still do think that until they can show everyone you're going to get hurt if you play us like this, I would still assume that they're going to be one of the most blitz teams in the NFL.
And I don't want to spend all day on the Ravens, but I know a lot of the fantasy community is interested in Isaiah Likely. When he did very well when Andrews was out, but it was usually less than 10 yards a game when Andrews was in. And obviously Andrews was more downfield. Likely was more run after the catch. But here's the thing. People want to extrapolate. He's going to be on the field, but the Ravens ran a lot of 21 personnel. They did heavy, occasionally 2 tight end sets. I think they would have to completely revamp their offense to make Likely a staple, and I don't see that happening. What do you think is going to happen with Isaiah Likely this year in terms of playing time and opportunity?
It's a great question. And the problem is they have a 21 personnel that's not really 21 personnel. So the way that they use Patrick Ricard, traditionally he was a fullback in the old Greg Roman offense. Yeah. But if you look at the way that he was used with Monken this year, he was playing tight end, quote unquote, a lot, where he's an H-back or he's at a wing position next to the line of scrimmage. And they were really successful in those looks. And I think it's for a few different reasons. When you have him attached to the formation as a blocker, he's very good at that. So their pass protection in those looks was great. And like we're talking about previously, if you have those looks where he's kind of a de facto offensive lineman and you have teams in heavy personnel, the way that you can throw the ball out of those situations is just different than you can without somebody like him on the field. So I think the Ravens probably understand the value he brings to their overall offensive identity and ecosystem. And I don't think that they're going to want to take him off the field. So that comes at the expense of snaps, opportunities for somebody like Isaiah Likely.
And just off point real quick, Derrick Henry's going to become really good friends with Patrick Ricard. Going to love having him on the field for sure in that running game. Now, we're going to move quickly to the Texans. And the Texans last year, they did not use 21 personnel to the rate, or even heavy personnel, to the rate that the Niners and the Dolphins did. And it's the same tree of the office of Bobby Slowick. I'm wondering, Robert, if that's because they couldn't trust their running game with Devin Singletary and Dameon Pierce. They bring in Joe Mixon, and Mixon at least can keep your offense on schedule. He'll get you to 3-4 yards, whereas Singletary would be 0, 1, and 8, where that's not helping your offense move. Do you think with Mixon brought in, and they actually extended him out, I believe, an extra year because he wasn't his last year of his deal. But that said, what do you think adding Mixon to the offense does for the usage of heavy personnel? Is it going to increase it, or what do you expect to happen with Mixon in the fold?
I actually think that the moves that they've made at receiver would have a bigger impact on the personnel that we see from the Texans, just because if you go back, and this is a long-winded way of explaining this, but if you go back to 2017, when Sean McVay got to Los Angeles, McVay's background wasn't as an 11 personnel coach. When he was in Washington, they used a lot of 12 personnel, a lot of multi-tight end sets. What happened was they kind of backdoored their way into being a heavy 11 personnel team because the best 11 players included Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, and at that stage, I want to say it was Brandon Cooks. I can't remember.
Sounds right. That sounds right.
Whoever their best 3 receivers were, they had an 11 personnel grouping. These are our best guys. Why would we take them off the field? If you look at what the Texans are now, they have Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell. That's their best 11 players. Like, God bless Andrew Beck, but he is not as dynamic a presence as those guys. So it's going to be fun to kind of watch them figure out, okay, how do we continue to manipulate defenses at the rate that we want to while having our best 11 players on the field? And that's something they'll figure out over the course of the season. That's not an answer they'll have in week 1. You'll spend the first month up through Halloween, essentially figuring out, okay, how do we best use this? What is our identity? And that's something that by the time you get to the second half of the year, hopefully they'll have a more distilled understanding of.
So that said, and there's a tough question and to put you on the spot with, who's going to be, if they do not always use 11 personnel, which probably maximum 75%. I doubt they go to the Rams like 92% of it, but who is typically the odd man out when they're going with 2 receiver sets, in your opinion?
That's a great question. I have to assume that I would guess Nico Collins will be the guy that we see on the field the most. They just paid him a ton of money. He had a fantastic season last year. My guess is that Diggs and Tank Dell, some combination of them would be the guys seeing a few more of like fewer snaps overall. One with Diggs, he's getting older. And I think that kind of taking some mileage off and understanding the Texans have one goal this year. The Texans want to win the Super Bowl. When you look at every move they made, that's what they want to do. I don't think they care about getting Stephon Diggs his 1,250 yards. So him being off the field a little bit more often and Tank Dell being off the field just because he's undersized, you're not being able to use him and as many roles as a blocker, etc. So I would assume that Nico Collins by the end of the year will have the most snaps among that group. And then we'll see kind of a rotation with those other receivers because Noah Brown is a great blocker. He plays a very specific role for them. Robert Woods is still on this team. So that would be my assumption, is that it's going to be frustrating for fantasy players because they don't understand who's going to be on the field and when, even if this offense is consistently humming.
We've seen Dalton Schultz get near 90 targets, probably 3 straight years. If I'm crafting this offense and I've got Collins and I've got Diggs and I've got Dell, I'm probably not designing a lot of plays to go to Dalton Schultz. If I need an outlet, I've got him. Do you think the targets take a significant hit because of the 3 receivers they have?
It's a great question. And part of this consideration is how often they're going to throw the ball. Because if you look at it, I assume in terms of total pass attempts, CJ Stroud had to be in the bottom half of the NFL last year. I mean, there are plenty of games where he's throwing the ball 22, 25 times. And that's an interesting push and pull with this offense, right? Because if you look at their overall approach, they ran the ball on early downs pretty consistently and very inefficiently. Their run game was awful last year,
Yes.
but they continued to do it. And I think a lot of people looking at it from a distance and just looking at numbers on a spreadsheet would say, well, why would you do that? Well, in order to give credence to your play action game and kind of have an offensive formula where one side informs the other, you're going to run the ball probably more than you should in a vacuum, but you can still go too far in that direction. So I wonder, as that offensive staff, as Bobby Slowick, Gerard Johnson, all those guys take a step back this offseason and say, all right, what is the right ratio here? Like, do we need to be running the ball 53% of the time on 1st and 10 in order to get the most out of the play action game and the downfield passing game? I would have to assume that when they come to their conclusion, understanding their quarterback is a full-fledged superstar already, that's going to drift a little bit more to the side where they're throwing the ball 33, 34 times a game, which they did not do last year. And that just means there are more targets to go around as a whole.
No, I love that. That's great insight on that and trying to figure this out. And I think you had a lot of good thoughts for the fantasy players to think about as they're deciding where to place these Texans in their draft orders. Now, one more team, and we're talking about heavy personnel. And again, Arthur Smith was with the Falcons last year. He's with the Steelers. They ran 80% heavy personnel. I think the Niners were at 60. It was by far the most we had seen. And they couldn't run the ball. And not effectively. And then Bijan wasn't getting enough carries. What happened and why couldn't they run the ball despite having all the heavy personnel on the field? Was it the lack of respect for the quarterbacks that were there and defenses didn't take it seriously, therefore didn't give them the proper looks? But when you lead into that, how does this translate to Pittsburgh?
It's a great question. And it's something that I've thought about and tried to figure out a bunch of times. And I've talked to people on that staff and just like, what happened last year? And I've never gotten a great answer. I think it's just one of those situations. The term I've used in trying to describe the Falcons offense in 2023 is that staff was just kind of lost in the sauce. They had so many guys and they had so many ideas for how they wanted to deploy those guys that I think that there was just too much on their plates. They tried to do too many things. They tried to have too many layers with the personnel usage and just what the offense felt like, that they really never got down to, all right, these are the 4 or 5 things that we do well, which was really frustrating on the running game side specifically because the running game was so good the year before when Tyler Algier was back there. So I would assume, and this is just outside looking in, Arthur Smith being in a situation where he is now the offensive coordinator with a defensive-minded head coach, I think that it puts some decent guardrails on him. We've seen him in that role before, and the 2020 Titans, the 2019 Titans, were some of the most efficient offenses in football. So if we can kind of, again, look at the overall menu of what the Falcons offense was in 2022, if we can chop off 35% of that and just get a more crystallized, kind of streamlined vision for how they want to use the personnel, I think the running game specifically in Pittsburgh is set up for success. That offensive line is currently constructed. Obviously, you got a couple young guys who are question marks. Zach Frazier, Troy Fontenot. You never know how rookie offensive linemen are going to play. But that group, combined with Darnell Washington, who is really intriguing as a run blocking piece, and the backs that they have, I really do think that group has a potential to be one of the more efficient running games in the NFL if they can hit their stride early in the year, even with a new coaching staff coming in.
Now, Robert, knowing and seeing this rushing attack for years under Arthur Smith, which running back, Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren, do you think gets more of the work, or is this a complete timeshare? They're very different runners. Who do you see emerging as the primary back?
I don't have a good or satisfactory answer here. And I think that it's going to be a frustrating experience because we've seen this so many times, right? I mean, how many different examples can we throw out? The one that I remember, because I lived it from a fantasy perspective, was the Aaron Jones. And who was with Aaron Jones in that backfield when he was young? I can't remember now.
Oh, Jamal Williams.
It was Jamal Williams, right? And so you see every time Aaron Jones touches the ball, it feels like he's gaining 7 yards. Like the efficiency numbers are just crazy. And he's getting like 8 carries a game. And it's just maddening. And Jaylen Warren was our version of that over the last couple of years. And I just think that some staffs understand, I want to get the most bang for the buck from this guy by giving him 10, 12 touches a game. To us, that is the best overall distribution of the workload. And I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see that, and we continue to be frustrated about how much Najee Harris we were seeing compared to a guy like Jaylen Warren, who is obviously more dynamic every single time he touches the ball.
Now, the tight end position, we saw Jonnu Smith have a career year, and then we watched Kyle Pitts not have a career year. 99th percentile average depth of target for Pitts. So, and from bad quarterbacks, that was never a good combination, yet Jonnu Smith was eating. In this offense, like you said, Darnell Washington is certainly going to be in there blocking. Really don't see him as a receiver. Probably could a little bit. What does that mean for Pat Freiermuth this season?
I think he'll be heavily involved. I mean, I think this is probably a team that will see more 12 personnel than 21 personnel just because of the guys they have on the roster. If you go back and you look at what the Titans were when Arthur Smith was there, it was more 12 than it was 21. And I just think that you can see it, right? I mean, the wide receiver depth chart on that Steelers team is not good. I mean, they don't have many bodies out there. So a world where it's George Pickens, some combination of Van Jefferson and Roman Wilson, and then Darnell Washington and Pat Freiermuth on the field consistently together, I think that's the most I mean, if you look at the percentages, I wouldn't be surprised if that collection of guys, those 4 skill position players plus a back, was the most used personnel grouping that the Steelers had next season.
Now, Arthur Smith really doesn't top out his receivers much over 110 targets. Back to the A.J. Brown days. He missed a little time when he was there. And then Drake London. George Pickens will at least have quarterbacks, no matter where they're at stage of career, both Fields or Wilson could probably get the ball downfield if that's what's chosen the way to use them. We knew that with Tannehill in the Tennessee days, there were a lot of great in-breakers off that play action. How do you, because Pickens is perfect for that. How do you see Pickens shaping up in this offense?
I'm excited to see it because I honestly think that there is a version of George Pickens we have not seen yet because of the quarterback play in Pittsburgh. And when going back and watching him again, that AFC North show that we did a couple weeks ago, the question we had about the Steelers is, what is the rest of this roster? Because we're so hyper focused on the quarterback. What are we actually talking about with the other 52 guys? And when I was watching the offense, I was really impressed at the diversity to George Pickens's game, because I think for the most part, he's painted as this big body ball winner outside the numbers. And I actually think his ability over the middle of the field on slants and just some of those change of direction routes, I'm actually pretty intrigued on what he can give you in that version of this offense. So I assume he's going to be fed, because even if A.J. Brown never got over a certain number of targets volume-wise, the target share he received within that Titans offense was robust, to say the least. And I think that if you look at George Pickens compared to the other receiving options within that group, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we got a heavy, heavy dose of him as a part of this passing game.
Hey, level up this year's fantasy football draft and make Stadium Swim your #1 pick. Stadium Swim at Circa Resort and Casino in downtown Las Vegas is America's favorite place to watch sports. 3 levels, 6 pools, and a 143-foot screen. It's the place to bring your league this season. Blow this year's draft out of the water with Stadium Swim's complete draft package. Make your picks poolside from the comfort of a temperature-controlled cabana with a custom Stadium Swim draft board and more. Plus, when you book a draft this season at Stadium Swim, your league will be entered to win the ultimate draft experience in 2025. Best league name wins it all. Don't miss out on all of the fantasy football fun. Stadium Swim is a 21 and up venue. For all the details and to reserve your spot today, go to circalasvegas.com. Robert, we talked about the teams that dominate the heavy personnel and a lot of the 21 personnel. We still have a number of teams that use heavy 11 personnel, and you cited the Rams earlier. And I like how you wove in the fact that McVay did come from the Shanahan tree and yet gets his best people on the field and has never really deviated from that. And we've seen McVay running over 90% 3 receiver sets. And then when it was protege, Zach Taylor runs it at the 3rd highest rate, which is down in the 75-ish% range. So it's a significant drop. But the first question I want to ask is, why are the 3 receiver sets from these specific teams and the other teams that have had success, why are they be able to have success in a league that's playing a lot of too high shells and a lot of zone?
If you look at what the Bengals have done, the Bengals run game, it looks a lot different than the Rams run game did really before last season. But even overall, the Bengals are a spread out 11 personnel team. If you look at it's a pretty simple measure of this, just width of formation over the last few years, the Bengals have averaged one of the widest formations in the NFL, and that's a product of their quarterback. Joe Burrow wants things to be spread out. He wants to be able to see how everything is operating. So for the Bengals, it's just, these are our best players. We're getting our 3 receivers on the field. We're spreading it out for our quarterback. This is how we want to live. For the Rams, the 11 personnel it's a means to dictate to defenses the same way that teams using heavy personnel do. If you're the Niners and you're in 21 and teams are going to have base defense on the field and line up at all these heavy boxes and play all this cover 3, you're deciding how the game is going to be played. If you're the Rams and you're in 11 personnel 90% of the time, teams are never going to play base defense against you. They're going to play nickel against you all the time. And as a result of that, you're deciding how the game is going to be played. So if you're Los Angeles and teams are playing nickel and your 3rd receiver, whether it was Cooper Kupp a couple years ago or Puka Nacua now, it blocks like a tight end, you now have a decided advantage because you're making teams line up in light bodies, and you, despite having light bodies with 3 receivers, can play like a 12 personnel team. You have an advantage before the game even starts.
So that's a great point. And I also want to tie in real quick with the Rams. You know what? Let me circle back to that later. I want to talk about the running game. So with the running game last year, and I know you pointed out on your show last year, the Rams are very good at getting downhill running going against the light fronts, and they had great success in the rushing game. Why was that so successful last year?
They changed the types of bodies that they had along that offensive line. I think that was a big part of it. So if you look at the history of kind of the Shanahan McVay type of offenses and the offensive lines that they built. When McVay got there in 2017, this was a heavy outside zone sort of offense. And historically, those outside zone Shanahan teams played with really light offensive linemen. Well, defenses around the NFL, if a third of the league or more is going to be running this Shanahan sort of offense, defenses see it often enough to come up with responses. So over time, from that 2017 through, let's say, the end of the 2018 season, when the Rams were running into those roadblocks against the Bears, the Lions, the Patriots in the Super Bowl, eventually teams are going to adjust. So the Rams over time had to recreate their running game. So what they did is they changed the types of offensive linemen they were signing, and they changed the construction of their running game overall. So they went from a more outside zone perimeter oriented run game to a more duo power sort of run game with bigger offensive linemen. If you look at the way the Rams offensive line is currently constructed, their 3 interior guys combined weigh 1,000 pounds. Like, they have the biggest interior in the league. And that is a far cry from when John Sullivan was lining up at center for the Rams in 2017 at like 290 pounds. So that shift, I think, is really indicative of where the league has gone overall. all of these offenses that used to be more outside zone perimeter heavy, they have developed figurative and literal counter runs as part of the overall equation. The Niners have done this. The Rams have done this. The Dolphins haven't really. They're their own little thing. But for the most part, run games have become more diverse around the league, and that's been dictated by several different factors.
And so I was going to bring up rushing attacks a bit early. I jumped the gun, but I'm going to continue on that. So copycat league. There were a number of teams like the Lions. It's hard to replicate because their line was so good and they did so many different things. But what things in the running game league wide might you see differently by the majority of teams, if anything, will be different this year than last year?
I just think it's about diversification and about flexibility, right? So if we're going to have a defense that is really hell bent on stopping one sort of run, do we have a counterpunch that we can lean into? Like the Dolphins are a great example. Okay. So the Dolphins have this really perimeter based outside running game because of the way their offensive line is constructed and because of the speed they have in their backfield. You saw defenses start to overcorrect against those sort of runs in the second half of last season. And to their credit, the Dolphins tried to lean into more downhill power-based running, but they didn't have the bodies to make it happen. So I just think that's the most important thing. From a schematic perspective and from an offensive line personnel perspective, are you constructed in such a way that if defenses are going to play you one way, you have an answer to kind of swerve against that? And I think more and more teams are investing in the offensive line to make that happen and investing in a more diversified breadth of running game options, just because that's what defenses are making them tap into.
Very generic question. As a whole, based on what teams may have learned last year, do you think the overall rushing attacks will be more effective this year because those concepts may generally be taken and used despite some teams not having the personnel? Or do you think it'll just be that some teams will have it and some teams won't, like in the past?
I think it's going to be the latter, just because so many different factors, in my opinion, lead to overall just, I think, the plateauing of run game efficiency. Because overall, if you look at the way the NFL has gone over the last, let's say 5 years, boxes have gotten consistently lighter, but running games haven't gotten more effective. And I think that's for a few different reasons. One, I think the talent along the defensive line is better. The gap between defensive line talent and offensive line talent is as big as it's ever been. I just think that is going to continue for a bunch of different reasons. It's practice time. It's the way that athletes are developed. It's just harder to have a really good offensive line compared to a really good defensive line. That's one. Two, this is just exposure. But when teams started playing in these light boxes, they didn't necessarily know how to fit the run, being at a disadvantage from a numbers perspective. But when you've done it now for 3, 4, 5 years, the league is cyclical. Defenses are going to catch up. So I just think that overall, more defensive coordinators have an understanding. Okay, if I'm outmanned by one, just from a numbers perspective, if they have 7 blockers and I have 6 guys in the box, or if it's 6 and 6, how am I going to defend this? They've had more time to figure that out. So now we're in kind of this weird inflection point where defenses have caught up to offenses, and now it's about the next iteration for offenses to figure out how to regain an advantage.
Man, that chess game is a beautiful thing. It's just year to year, just week to week. Love to see that. Now, so we were talking the teams with 11 personnel earlier. We talked about McVay. You outlined very well how Zach Taylor has Joe Burrow, and so they handle it a bit differently with the wider sets. There are a couple other coaches. We won't talk much about Kevin O'Connell. I just want to point out, as a descendant, he goes below the league average in 11 personnel, which is, again, another player from the tree, but just doing his own thing. It leads to 2 more coaches for this year I think a lot of people want to know about. So Zach Robinson now runs the Falcons offense, coming from the McVay tree. What, off the top of your head, do you think we might expect to see from the Falcons offense with Zach Robinson running it?
It's a great question, because right now I think if you look at their offensive depth chart at receiver, I mean, they still have Drake London. They went out and signed Darnell Mooney in free agency. Rondale Moore is more of a unique piece than he is like a full-time receiver. So I still think that you could make an argument that this is not a team where 11 personnel is just a de facto their best 11 players. So I actually don't know what we'll see. My guess is we'll see them lean into more 11 just because that's where Zach comes from. If you look at the Falcons or the Vikings specifically, I would guess, and I mean, again, you can look this up. I would guess they used more 11 in Kevin's first year than he did in Kevin's second year. And part of the reason for that is they went out and signed Josh Oliver because they hated how inefficient their run game was in year one. So what we typically see is team offensive coordinators going to new places. They're going to bring over most of the ideas from the last place they were just because they're most fluent in those ideas. But then after a full year of understanding what those offensive principles looked like filtered through their players, that's when we see these guys start to diverge from their history. So I would assume that we'll see a pretty healthy copy of what the Rams do offensively, at least to start in Atlanta, before those guys understand, okay, this is actually our best path forward.
Now, Robert, we're both from Chicago, and we've seen Darnell Mooney have a really good season, and we've seen the team have a dysfunctional offense and not use him well, and we've seen wide open downfield passes miss him. Well, Mooney, 4.3 speed, has Drake London across from him. Hopefully Kyle Pitts is deployed as an actual receiver and not just a deep threat. What do you see Mooney's role potentially being, and can he reemerge as a strong fantasy option?
It's a great question. I don't know what to make of Darnell Mooney because I liked him early in his career, but I always felt like some of the opinions of Darnell Mooney were slanted because of what he looked like compared to the other Bears pass catching options. Like, yeah, he was the best receiver on the Bears. That's not saying much.
No.
And so I really don't know. I mean, from a down to down basis, I thought that he was better than the numbers bore out last year, but the numbers were awful. And so, again, that's not really saying much. I think that was a pretty healthy contract for what Darnell Mooney is at this stage in his career. But there's a chance that the Falcons and Ryan Pace, who is in Atlanta, see something in him that maybe the rest of us don't, or we couldn't because of the lack of infrastructure for the Bears offense over the last couple of years.
The last coach that may be in the McVay tree a bit, Liam Cohen. Now, he went between Kentucky and working with McVay. Now he's with the Bucs. And one offseason comment I heard him say is he wants to get Chris Godwin in the slot more. Smart move, because he's one of the best slot receivers we have. What are you expecting Liam Cohen to do? And before I go on, Baker Mayfield did so well being able to throw downfield to Mike Evans last year that the tackles did a good enough job protecting. That worked out well. But what do you expect Cohen to do with this offense, and what areas of success might you hope to see?
I think 11 personnel is kind of the basis of who they are. Makes the most sense because I can't remember his name, but the rookie receiver they drafted last year, the speed guy. So they have, so Trey Palmer, Godwin, Mike Evans, and then they drafted Jalen McMillan, I think, in the third round. And so they have a pretty deep group of receivers, and Godwin makes total sense as a bigger, using him in the slot is like the baseline of who he is, just because, like we talked about, if you're going to have 11 personnel as your standard group personnel grouping, you want to be able to run the ball out of 11 personnel. And Chris Godwin has been a very effective blocker from that spot for a good chunk of his career. And I actually think a lot of the stuff they did with Godwin when Bruce Arians was there is something that totally applies to what the Rams did last year with Puka Nacua. It's a lot of insert runs. It's a lot of duo runs. So there's a lot of overlap between the best version of Chris Godwin that we saw in the Bruce Arians era and what they could theoretically do with him this year in like a Puka Nacua adjacent role.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Godwin goes. And at least we know Baker Mayfield has a history with slot receivers. Jarvis Landry and they average close to 1,000 yards over a couple season period. So Mayfield can involve a slot receiver in that way as well. But like you said, the blocking aspects will certainly help as well. Is Mike Evans in this offense? Do you think he can continue in the same type of capacity, knowing Mayfield likes to throw deep, or is Cohen going to maybe move away from that?
I think so. I mean, I think that Mike Evans is somebody that we've seen. He's almost situation agnostic. Like, it doesn't really matter what type of offensive team is running. It doesn't really matter who else is out there. I mean, he's somebody, even at this stage of his career, that is going to produce really no matter the circumstances. And I would continue to bet on that. I mean, if there is going to be a year where we saw a downturn and who Mike Evans was last year was going to be that year. And even that didn't happen. So I feel pretty good that even with this shift in the offensive scheme, even with, some questions about what that's going to look like, that Mike Evans is still going to be a pretty safe bet.
We will talk more NFL trends after we take a short break. All right, Prize Picks is the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country. Prize Picks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than a minute. You just pick more or less on 2 or more players, stats, and watch the winnings roll in. The posted yardage projection for the 2024 season for A.J. Brown, 1,275 yards. Justin Jefferson, 1,375 yards. And Deontay Johnson, 825 yards. I'm going with the more on each of these numbers. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what makes Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Download the app today and use the code ROTOPOD for a first deposit match up to $100. That's promo code ROTOPOD for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Robert, let's talk about the defensive side of the football. So NFL as an aggregate, 73% zone last year. There were a few teams that played really heavy man. Bill Belichick, no longer there. Dan Quinn, who does move to Washington. I hope they don't play man with that secondary, but another story. The Browns certainly ran a lot with counting on their pass rush and their 3 corners, and the Giants ran it quite a bit. But otherwise, most of the other teams were running it over 75% of the time. What adjustments have you seen offensives make to all this zone defense? And do you see anything getting changed further this year?
I think we're going to continue to see offenses lean into just an ability and almost like a necessity to be flexible and have options within play. So if this is a kind of overall arc of kind of how this has all gone over the last 10 years, going back to when the Seattle 3 world kind of ruled the NFL, and you had a combination of cover 3 and man, like where Dan Quinn comes from. Offenses understood that, all right, they're going to be in a lot of 3 and a lot of cover 1, and we can dial up plays designed to attack those coverages. What's happened over the last 3, 4, 5 years is that it's been harder to understand and predict what you're going to be getting from the back end of defenses. Teams are going to be lining up in a 2-high shell, and that can distribute into anything. That can be cover 4. It can be cover 3. It can be man. It can be cover 2. So it's harder to dial up plays that are designed to attack one specific coverage. So what offenses have done is they've built in what you could probably call all-purpose sort of plays. Whatever coverage a team is playing, we're going to have an answer built within the play to find something no matter what you're doing. And that leads to more pure progression reads where quarterbacks are kind of sweeping the board from left to right. You're not necessarily making a choice based on what coverage you think you're playing. You're literally dropping back and going, okay, I'm going to go from this side to this side, and whoever's open, I'm going to throw them the ball. So we're seeing more of that. And the other thing that we're seeing is, I think, fewer play action dropbacks, because one of the reasons that teams were really leaning into that approach on defense is that it was such a play action heavy league dictated by what the Rams were doing and to a degree what the Niners were doing. If you're lined up with 4 guys in a quarter's look and the quarterback turns his back to the defense by using play action, and then he turns around and you're in something different, that hurts a quarterback. That's hard to play against. So I think we've seen a lot of teams say, well, if we're not even going to create that level of indecision with our quarterback, we're going to let him continue to see the entire defense as they rotate. So I think just it's all a downstream product of defenses wanting everything to look the same no matter what, and offenses having to react to what that version of NFL defense looks like.
So now when we talk about zone defense, last year we saw a lot of tight end production from the top end players for sure. And the question that fantasy managers are asking, well, is this a product of we just had this great group of tight ends come in, which I think every year forever, we have great tight ends come in, or was it just a natural way to attack zone defenses? You got to attack, the soft spots, the seams. So which was it last year? Was it a great group of tight ends, or was it the league learning to attack zones where there are holes?
I think that the first 2 factors in that are real. I would say the third factor in this is offensive coordinators around the NFL getting better at tight end utilization. because a lot of these teams, if you go back and you look at the history of rookie tight ends specifically, it's a graveyard of production because a lot of these guys were just dropped into traditional tight end roles. You are going to be a wide tight end attached to the line of scrimmage. You're going to have to block. You're going to have to be a pass catcher. That is a lot to throw on a guy early in his career, especially if you're not physically quite there yet with an ability to hold up against NFL defensive linemen. Well, that goes out the window if you're just going to turn one of your tight ends into a de facto receiver. You're not asking Dalton Kincaid to block at the point of attack against a defensive end on an outside zone run. You're not asking Sam Laporta to do a lot of the things that traditional tight ends were asked to do when we lived in a 12 personnel world that, these guys were both de facto tackles in a lot of situations. So I think that we've just gotten to a point where a lot of offensive coaches understand, if I don't ask this guy to do the things he's bad at, and I just ask him to do the things he's good at, isn't that the best way to get the most out of him? And I think there's more and more teams willing to embrace that sort of mindset.
So this year, we like I said, moving, like I like how you talked about Sam Laporta, and there's been other shows where he can line him up as an X. You can line him up as a single ISO side, and he can win there. There are a few tight ends that can actually do that. Hopefully, Kyle Pitts sees a little more of that this season, especially if they can optimize him instead of going deep on every play. But all that said, do you think that there's going to be more of the tight end usage on the isolation side than we've seen in the past, or is that kind of peaked out?
I think we might see that for a few different reasons. One, you have guys that can win in those situations. And two, it is another way for you to dictate to defenses. If you're going to put, and the Rams were very, very good at this early in the Matthew Stafford tenure, where they would just put Tyler Higbee at the number one spot on the outside. And if you're going to do that, then inevitably you're going to have a linebacker somewhere covering one of your receivers. So I think more and more teams understand that as a way to just make things easier on yourself. If you're going to have a corner covering your tight end, it doesn't really matter if your tight end is going to win in those situations. You're giving yourself advantages elsewhere. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a little bit more of that as more teams around the league understand and kind of become aware of the advantages it can create for you.
And Robert, we've seen a lot of teams in the last couple of years really ramp up the simulated pressure idea. Can you tell the audience what simulated pressure really means?
So simulated pressure is when you're bringing a non-traditional four rushers. So if you're lining up with, let's say, a linebacker mugged up to the line of scrimmage, or, a nickel corner blitzing, you're only bringing four rushers, but you're dropping out a defensive lineman. So it's a four rushers that's hard for the offense to predict. And I think that at its core is the value of that sort of approach. This goes back to, again, just the baseline thing that defenses are trying to accomplish. We are trying to present a look to you that you do not know how it's going to unfold. You don't know what coverage we're going to play. You don't know which guys are going to be rushing the passer. So it's about maintaining soundness as a defense while being unpredictable. And I think the Ravens were the best possible example of this last year. The Ravens under Wink Martindale, they're bringing 5-6 man pressures all the time.
Yep.
I mean, it's the most aggressive, in your face, blitz happy approach that you could possibly imagine. The Ravens under Mike Macdonald were a below average blitz rate team, but it's about how they were rushing the passer. They're bringing 4, but Kyle Hamilton is one of those guys. They're bringing 4, but Patrick Queen is one of those guys. Everybody can blitz from any position. So you're creating flexibility and unpredictability while still maintaining your zone coverage rules and being able to play traditional defenses behind it. And I think we're going to see more and more teams continue to do that, because you don't want to just rush the same 4 guys over and over again because you're making it easy on the quarterback, but you also don't want to bring 5 or 6 pass rushers and leave yourself susceptible on the back end. So you're trying to find a middle ground that makes it hard on offenses, but easy on yourself. And I think that's why we're seeing more and more teams around the league embrace the sort of style of defense that the Ravens played last year.
So, Robert, you talked earlier about how quarterbacks may do this sweep left to right or right to left in reading defenses. If we see increased usage of simulated pressures, what does that do to quarterbacks that will want to make the sweep across read if they don't know where the pressure is coming? How does that all work together, and how might you see that as the league moves forward with more simulated pressure?
It's just about creating splash plays, right? So if we know that it's hard. You need to create explosives as a defense every once in a while. And I think the Ravens game against the Niners is a perfect example, right? You don't need to be blitzing all the time, but when you do something unconventional, when you drop a guy into a passing lane, when you bring a corner off the edge, can you create 2 or 3 splash plays over the course of a game? And I think that's what defenses are trying to do. If I'm going to drop a linebacker or defensive lineman into coverage, or if I'm going to have somebody in a spot you didn't expect them to be, can that create 1 second of hesitation where it's a sack? Can that create one bad decision from a quarterback where it's a tip ball or an interception? And I think that's the goal. It's not about having these plays be the basis of who you are on offense. It's about dropping 4, 5, 6 of them in over the course of the game and creating 1 or 2 splash plays on defense as a result of that.
So now 2 sides to Mike Macdonald, who you talked about earlier in Baltimore. He was wonderful using simulated pressures. With him being gone from the Ravens, do you think the Ravens are going to take a hit defensively as they Zach Orr, I believe, is the defensive coordinator now? Are they going to take a hit because of losing Macdonald, or do you think they can somehow keep things going? And I know they lost Patrick Queen and a couple other players, but what do you think the defense on the Ravens could look like without Macdonald?
I think that they have the advantage of being able to teach it in the same way that they have over the last couple of years. And I think that's one of the hardest things to do is when you just take one coach from a staff, and now that coach is tasked with installing the entire defense and bringing over that model with him. That can be difficult to do. But the fact that the Ravens have a good chunk of the staff they had last year to be able to teach the defense to those guys and be able to communicate those ideas, that's helpful. But at the same time, your defensive play caller is really important. A guy who knows when to push the right buttons over the course of the game. I don't think the Ravens are going to have the best defense in the NFL again. I wouldn't be surprised if the Ravens didn't have one of the 5 best defenses in the NFL this year. Defense is volatile, and Mike Macdonald, in my opinion, is probably the best defensive coordinator in the league. So I don't think you can overstate how important and how impactful those 2 factors are when thinking about what the 2024 Ravens are going to look like.
And then finally, so now Macdonald's with the Seahawks. What are your expectations in year 1 as he tries to bring his ideas into an offense that obviously hasn't had that?
I think that they'll be better. If you're expecting them to be the 2023 Ravens, I think you'll be disappointed just because it takes years to install that system. It takes years to refine it. It takes years to understand your personnel and how to properly deploy them. What I expect from the Seahawks is what I expect whenever you get a real kind of stabilizing force on either side of the ball. When you bring in the right offensive or defensive coach, what happens is you get the best version of every guy on that side of the ball. When you have adequate talent, you can play well. If you have good talent, you can play really well. If you have very good talent, you can be at an elite level. So I think the Seahawks are at a spot where they have adequate talent on the defensive side of the ball, and we'll see them be an average or slightly above average defense. And compared to what they've been over the last couple of years, that's a huge improvement. And I think that's exactly what you're looking for when you go out and make a hire like a Mike Macdonald.
One more question. I hate to tie up a little more, but now you made me think when you mentioned the Seahawks and Ryan Grubb's going to come in and coach. And we go from Shane Waldron. Waldron, in my opinion, did wonders with Geno Smith. It worked out very, very well in the 2 years they were together. Now, with the roster being shaken up a bit, now Will Dissly's gone and Colby Parkinson's gone. And this was a team that played a good percentage of heavy personnel last year. Very quickly, are your thoughts on what we could expect from Liam Cohen's offense with the current roster that Seattle has?
I think we'll see more 11 just because that's what they did in Washington last year. And that's their best set of players, right? If you can get DK Metcalf, JSN, and Tyler Lockett on the field together, I think that's a huge improvement. I also think that, I don't quote me on this because I don't know if this is actually true, but this is just an assumption. Their pass protection issues last year and some of the injuries they had to endure along the offensive line, they used multiple tight end sets as a way to insulate themselves. And I think that now you're going into the season with Charles Cross, Abe Lucas healthy. You've made some improvements and additions on the interior of the offensive line. There's a chance you can live in 11 personnel and feel better about your pass protection than you did last year. So I expect that offense to be really good. I really do, just because I love watching what Ryan Grubb did at Washington last year. And I actually think that those ideas from Washington's offense grafted onto Geno Smith and the offensive personnel Seattle has is actually a beautiful fit. It really does match what Geno's skill set is and what the skill set of those receivers are. So even if I think Seattle's defense still has a very long way to go, Seattle's offense was a borderline top 10 unit for the last couple of years. They didn't take any steps back personnel wise. And I'm very excited about the play caller. So overall, that's a group I'm pretty bullish about.
Now, Tyler Lockett's bordering 32 years old. He's right around that edge, and his yards after the catch were one of the worst we've seen. I believe it was less than 15%, now 8th off the top of my head. And Jackson Smith and Jigba used a little more as the season went on. Even though they're probably all going to play, are we going to see a changing of the guard where Smith and Jigba is much more heavily involved and Lockett slowing down a bit? Or are you?
I would hope so. Because I just think that when I watched that offense last year, one of the things that was most frustrating about it is they asked so much of the quarterback in terms of the plays they were asking him to make, the throws they were asking him to make. It was a high degree of difficulty sort of offense. It would go back to that idea of with a formation. The Seahawks had the widest formations in the NFL last year. It's a lot of outside the numbers, high degree of difficulty throws. And I think introducing somebody like JSN into the mix where you have a reliable middle of the field target who can win on choice routes on third down, who can be sort of a man beater for you in those situations. I actually think more of him is the perfect antidote to some of the frustrating aspects we saw from Seattle's offense over the second half of last year.
Robert, could you tell everyone what work you have going on and why fantasy football players, our RotoWire subscribers, should get an advantage by subscribing to The Athletic and listening and following The Athletic Football Podcast?
We do the Athletic Football Show 3 times a week all year. So we're still coming your way throughout the summer, doing some more kind of big picture stuff right now. We ranked the supporting casts in the AFC earlier this week. We're doing the NFC later. And I think that's a perfect example, looking at, okay, how much are these quarterbacks actually propped up by their pass catchers, by their offensive line, by their play caller? I mean, that is a pretty simple way to maybe find some hidden reasons why you should prefer one quarterback over another. And that's really what we do, kind of look at overall just the nuts and bolts of how these teams are constructed, how they operate. And we hope that somewhere along the way, you can pick up a couple nuggets that might help you with your fantasy draft.
Yeah, and again, if you've never heard Robert before and this is the first time, him and the crew over at The Athletic, you can't miss out on this opportunity. If you want to learn football, if you want to be smarter about it, you enjoy the game so much more the more you learn about it. Like I said in the beginning, the numbers are nice and the numbers drive fantasy, but it's everything else that makes it go. These are human beings. These are teams. And Robert and the team at The Athletic, they get it. So definitely make sure you're following Robert at Robert Mays, M-A-Y-S. And remember, follow The Athletic Football Show and subscribe to the site, and you'll be a big winner for football and for fantasy. Robert, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. It was a blast. We want to thank our sponsor, Prize Picks, the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country. And thanks to everyone for listening. Come back next week for another edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast.